Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. This was said by Margaret Mead, a U.S. anthropologist and social psychologist. In the 60s and 70s, Mead's work inspired a lot of changes in the advancement of science. Women like this are what sparked the feminist movement in the 1800s. From then on, women have continued to stay persistent and make glorious strides in gender equality. However, while the gender gap is still closing, it is doing so at an alarmingly slow rate. Throughout the years, women have fought long and hard to make this country equal for all genders, yet the gap has refused to completely close based off of outdated and new laws combined.
One major thing that divides the genders is the pay gap. And the gender gap in pay has slightly diminished since 1980, but it's still remained somewhat stable over the past 15 years. According to a 2018 Pew Research Center analysis of median hour earnings for both full and part-time workers in the United States, women earned 85% of what men earned. And based on this data, it would take an extra 39 days of work for women to earn what men did in 2018. So comparingly, the estimated 15-cent gender gap among all workers in 2018 has decreased from 36 cents in 1980. So much of the gap can be explained by measurable factors such as educational opportunities, occupational segregation, and work experience. However, the gender discrimination in the workplace is an unmeasurable factor contributing to the ongoing wage difference. In a 2017 Pew Research Center survey, 4 in 10 working women said they have experienced gender discrimination at work, compared with 2 in 10 men who said the same. One of the most commonly reported forms of discrimination focused on earnings inequality. 1 in 4 employed women said that they have earned less than a man who is doing the same job, while just 5% of men said they've earned less than the woman doing the same job. Both men and women see inequalities in the workplace. In a 2014 Pew Research Center study, 77% of women and 63% of men said that this country needs to continue making changes to give men and women equality in the workplace. For women, family caregiving responsibilities can lead to constant interruptions in career paths for women and can have an impact on their long-term earnings. In a 2013 survey, women were more likely than men to take breaks from their careers to take care of their family. Roughly 4 in 10 mothers said that they at some point in their life had to take a significant amount of time off of work or reduce their work hours to care for their child or other family member. And about a quarter said that they had to quit altogether to take care of their family responsibilities. Only a few men said the same. Even though women have increased their presence in higher paying jobs traditionally dominated by men, such as professional and managerial positions, women as a whole continue to be overrepresented in lower paying occupations.
Okay, another thing that causes gender gap is laws that we have. And throughout history, we have made laws to keep citizens of the United States safe and happy. However, we all have heard of those ridiculous laws where we sit and wonder why they were put in place. For example, according to Business Insider in Florida, if you own a bar, restaurant, or any place which liquor can be sold, you will be fined up to $1,000 if participants are allowed in any contest of dwarf tossing. Or, like in Illinois, where it is a crime to possess more than $600 worth of salamanders. If you're wondering, that's about 75 salamanders. These laws are in place for a reason and have somewhat of an effect on the community it addresses. However, these are not necessary in order to keep the general population of our country safe. These pointless laws don't only apply to the 21st century legislation, but are part of the United States culture since the start of it. And some are not as funny as others. The United States has been in the habit of creating laws in which have only directly benefited less than 30% of the population. While this was a bigger problem in the early stages of the country, which included laws discriminating against African Americans, women, and immigrants, in the 21st century, with how progressive the country has become, it would be believed that these laws would be eliminated in our country. And it slowly is. However, women's rights have slowly become more equal, and discriminatory laws are slowly becoming scarce. Starting off in the beginning of our country, we see the first laws put in place to hold women back. Susan Milligan, a senior editor for the U.S. News, wrote an article highlighting the major laws put in place. In the beginning of the article, she calls attention to the 1769 law in which decreed women cannot own property in their own name or keep their own earnings. This was the first documented law in which limited women. This led to the 1777 law, which prohibited women the right to vote. This kind of lawmaking directly benefited men, or more specifically, white men. During this time period, white men held themselves extremely high and didn't really like anyone who was different get close to them. Of course, women didn't allow this for too long. In 1884, 300 women and men signed the Declaration of Sentiments in Sigma Falls, New York. The Declaration was the first petition against women discrimination. 52 years later, every state legislation granted married women the right to keep their own wages and their own property in their name. And 20 years after that, the 19th Amendment was passed, which granted women the right to vote.
Another thing that affects women and how they are still being discriminated against is education. Education seems to have a gap that is closing, at least in the US, and in fact, now more women attend secondary schooling than their male counterparts. However, according to UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, 2/3 of countries have reached a gender parity value in enrollment in primary education, but countries that have not reached parity, like example, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and South Asia, the girls are more likely to be at a disadvantage than their male counterparts. Specifically, 65 million girls are out of school globally, and 32 million fewer girls than boys are in primary school in countries that are not in the UN. And following that, specifically because many countries are not in the UN, there are 2/3 of the 792 million illiterate adults in the world that are female. You would believe that with the gap closing in the US, that there would be more literate women in general, but just because it's happening in one place doesn't mean it's going to happen everywhere. In fact, if they did have an education, it would be amazing. Girls with secondary education are 6 times less likely to be married as children, which would help their mental lives amazingly. And if all girls had a secondary education, there would be 2/3 fewer child marriages, 2/3 few child marriages, proof that it really does affect whether or not they would be married off by their family. It's also known that a literate mother has 50% higher chance that her child will survive past the age of 5. Perhaps this is because she learns how to take care of the child or is aware of the skills needed to survive as an adult while taking care of another person. There are 9.9 million girls out of school in Nigeria, Pakistan, and Ethiopia. Instead, they are working at farms or they are taking care of housework while their siblings, their brothers, their fathers work at school or go into the military. And child deaths would be cut in half if all women had a secondary education, which saves 3 million lives. All maternal deaths would be reduced by 2/3 if each mother had completed primary education, because then they would be able to understand the risks and understand what was happening. And gender inequality is a major cause and effect of hunger and poverty. 60% of chronically hungry people are women and girls, which could be caused by it being harder to gain jobs when you do not have the education you need to successfully do these jobs. In Cambodia, 48% of rural women are illiterate compared to 14% of men, again showing how men are more likely to be in school in places outside of the US than they are for girls, because it is so frowned upon for women and girls to gain an education. Data from 68 countries indicate that a woman's education is a key factor in determining a child's survival. So the fact that they won't let women gain an education is detriment to their own children, and yet they still do not willingly let the women go to school. And children with mothers with no education are 3.1 times more likely to die than with mothers who have secondary or tertiary education. And in general, it just affects everyone who's around them. So it shows really well the problems that come with the fact that women and children still are not allowed to go to school when their male counterparts can.
So in conclusion, women have had to tirelessly suffer through unjust gender inequalities of our society. Unequal play, differing educational opportunities, and insulting abortion laws are just a few of the outlandish factors that constantly feed into the ridiculous gender gap women face today. Although it may seem like there is no hope for equality between men and women, studies have shown that it will happen sometime in the somewhat near future. According to a graph created by the Washington Post, the closest state in the United States to officially close the pay gap is Florida, ranking it at 19 years in 2038. Overall, while there is sufficient data to support the closing of the gender gap in our society, it sadly won't be a reality until at least 20 years into the future.